So I've checked out of the office and into tennis camp, and here's everything it's taught me about organizational performance metrics. I wish I was kidding, but also kind of not, because over the week I've been really reflecting on the fact that some of the things that contribute to long-term value creation, resilience, and performance are actually some of the hardest things to measure. And you know what they say, you can't improve on what you don't measure. But what happens when those things that contribute to long-term success are actually abstract? Things like trust, judgment, adaptability, strategic relationships, organizational energy. Maybe we've become so good and so sophisticated at tracking those visible results, we've actually underinvested in the invisible systems that actually help us get there. We often hear the phrase, what gets measured gets managed, and I do think that's true. But the more I think about it, the more I've been wondering about the opposite. What about the things that really matter but are super hard to measure? Not because they're nice to haves, but they're the things that actually determine whether something succeeds or fails in the first place. And I think this becomes even more interesting in the age of AI because AI is getting really good at doing the things that we traditionally value. Analysis, execution, optimization, productivity. If we are able to truly democratize AI and everyone has access to these capabilities, what actually becomes the differentiator? When I'm thinking about how I future-proof myself, my mind goes directly to the things that are the hardest to automate. Can you navigate ambiguity? Can you take people along with you on a journey? Can you earn and build trust? Can you connect ideas across different disciplines and domains? And most importantly, can you make good decisions even when there isn't a perfect answer? These things are so much harder to measure, and I think these are some of the most valuable capabilities that we have. And I guess in other words, some of the hardest things to measure are going to become the most important things to cultivate, especially in this era of AI. In tennis, the scoreboard only tracks points, games, and sets. But elite performance is actually built on the things you can't immediately see. By the time you get onto the courts and into the game, all of the practice, all of the muscle memory, all of the repetitive drills to get you to where you are actually the things that are invisible. The thing about scoreboards is they're not wrong. They're actually really useful. They tell you who's winning and by how much, and they also tell you the final outcome. But what they don't tell you is how that outcome happened. And organizations have their own versions of this, right? Revenue, pipeline, growth, productivity. These are our scoreboards, and don't get me wrong, these things absolutely matter. But by the time revenue shows up on the scoreboard, the work has already happened. The relationships have been built. We're already in position. We've earned trust, and the market timing was either right or it wasn't. I've spent most of my career working in sustainability and transformation. And one of the things that I've observed over and over again is that when an organization looks successful on the outside, what you're actually seeing are the results of decisions, investments, and behaviors that were made years earlier. What we often celebrate are the visible results, but we spend a lot less time trying to understand the invisible conditions that created it. Not everything that matters is immediately measurable, and not everything measurable creates lasting value. Great players don't win by hitting the ball harder all the time. It's about adaptability, positioning, the moments of preparation just before you hit the shot, and the hours of conditioning and practice before you even get into the game. One of the biggest lessons tennis is teaching me is that performance isn't about intensity. Sometimes it's about recovery or pacing. It's knowing when to push and when to conserve energy. And it's really about being able to sustain that performance over a long period of time, endurance. And I think organizations really struggle with this as well because many teams are good at sprinting, but how many of them are actually good at sustaining momentum? We often celebrate urgency, responsiveness, activity, busyness, but very rarely do we talk about organizational energy. Are people aligned? Do they have the bandwidth to do their best work? Can the organization absorb change and restructure without becoming too fragmented? Can it sustain performance through uncertainty? These things rarely show up on a dashboard, and yet they determine whether a strategy succeeds or fails. Resilience isn't built in the moment you need it, just like fitness isn't built during the match. It's built beforehand through investments that might not be immediately visible, but become invaluable when the pressure is on. And maybe that's the bigger question. Not whether we should measure things, but whether we're measuring the right things, because measurement isn't neutral. What gets measured gets attention, and if it gets attention, it's going to get investment. And when there's investment, it's going to get prioritized and scaled. And eventually, it's going to start to shape behavior and performance, and maybe even culture. If all we measure are short-term outputs, then we're going to optimize for short-term outputs. And if all we celebrate are visible wins, then we're going to overlook the conditions that created them. And I think this is super important right now, because if AI is making things like analysis, execution, and productivity more accessible, the question becomes less about how much more we can do, but more about what we build. The relationships worth investing in, the capabilities to be developing, the signals we should be paying a little bit more attention to, and the behaviors worth rewarding. These things often feel intangible right up until the moment they're needed, but by then, usually it's too late to build them. The organizations that create lasting, durable value, they're not necessarily the ones that are working the hardest, but they're the ones that are investing in the foundations that enable performance, resilience, and innovation to compound over time. I think that's what this week reminded me of, which is by the time something becomes visible on a scoreboard, the systems underneath it have already been built. And I think that goes way beyond tennis, right? Things like trust, judgment, adaptability, relationships, energy, those things never show up nicely and neatly on a dashboard. And yet those might be the contributors that actually make a difference when it comes to long-term value creation, performance, and resilience.
Last one, very good. Finish. No, finish. Yeah.